we're going to hear from Peter Bryant. He'll give us a bit of a keynote, and then we'll do an in-conversation session. So as you welcome Peter to the stage, allow me to formally introduce him. Associate Professor Peter Bryant is an Associate Dean of Education at the University of Sydney. Peter has a 25-year career that's seen him working across adult education, work-based learning, marketing and creative sectors. Most interestingly, Peter has significant experience leading education technology programs to support the professional and policy development of teams in higher education that spans both institutions in Australia and across the UK. So, Peter, thank you very much for being with us. Welcome.
Thank you. So I'm really looking forward to the conversation that will ensue from today's discussion.
I think you're going to begin with a bit of a keynote component. That's right. You give us 10 or 15 minute scene setting, and then I'll come back. Is that right? I'm sort of looking at you because I'm sort of looking at my run sheet and it says that's what's going to happen.
I am going to share my PowerPoint and just...
Okay, so let's get that up on screen.
Okay. It says update my system permissions, apparently. Let's try that again. Share. No, it's not allowing me to do it. So
I'm just going to check with my control room. I think, have we got the PowerPoint presentation?
You probably haven't, but that's okay. I think I can talk, and that's okay. I can just talk to it and explain. It's only going to be a short presentation, so I'll just start with this.
Okay.
So my background is I am the Associate Dean of Education at the University of Sydney Business School. The University of Sydney is one of Australia's oldest universities and has about 75,000 students. Those 75,000 students in the business school, we've got about 16,500 of those, and 68% of them are international students, which means in the current environment, the vast majority of those international students, around 83% of them, are offshore currently. Our business school is is a globally ranked business school. We have accreditations in most of the major business school accreditations, which means that our students generally have some of the highest levels of employability after completing their degree of any business school students in the country. The pandemic years, however, have fractured the futures of our higher education for our students at the University of Sydney Business School in two different ways. Firstly, it has changed the expectation of experience that they were going to have of their higher education. We are just about to graduate our first group of students who have never set foot in the campus in our Masters of Commerce program, which is quite a frightening concept for a university that is not generally imbued with the skills of delivering online learning. The second way it's fractured is it's fractured the environment they're going into, and the work environment, their expectations of mobility and their expectations of being able to attain the particular type of job they want to get at the completion of their degree have been heavily fractured. So that means that the education that we deliver, the way in which we structure curriculum and the way in which we do teaching, learning and assessment have to adapt to those very fractured environments. So we went and asked our students, and we said to them in very visual forms, taking photos of your environment, making films, sharing social media, tell us what you're feeling about the kind of fractured environments you're in. And they told us that they were isolated. They felt socially isolated. They felt that their rites of passage from where they were in school or after their first degree to where they want to be in employment have been disrupted. And they felt that they're very much wrapped in what academics like to refer to as a liminal journey, that they're feeling uncertain. They don't know what their current state is, and that they feel everyone around them doesn't know what their current state is, and they don't know how to actually aggregate and connect well with others when they've lost some of the fairly established social norms that they're used to in an educational environment. We also asked our academics what they felt about this whole process, and they told us that they felt they were losing their space. Their campus was their space, their classroom was their space. They felt they were losing it, and they felt that the way in which they were actually having to educate meant that they were having to share spaces that they were not necessarily comfortable with. Their house, their backyard, wherever they were sitting, it was kind of like it wasn't an invasion of privacy, but it was kind of a window into a world that they were not necessarily comfortable in sharing. And that then challenged their location and identity as academics. So part of the way in which we approach this at the business school is that we have taken what we've called a project called Connected Learning at Scale. And the idea about Connected Learning at Scale is, how do we actually build in at the design level of units of study, curriculum and programs, an approach that actually enhances the student experience through making connections. And we built Connected Learning at Scale in a very proactive way to transform all three parts of the student experience, which was moving how we dealt with the lecture, or how we dealt with the transmission and engagement of content, how we dealt with the classroom experience, the time spent with an academic in a face-to-face environment, and how we dealt with assessment, and how we dealt with the feedback and feed forward we give our students. And how do we change those in a way that actually leverages scale, that doesn't just cope with it, magnify it, or replicate itself in order to manage at scale, but actually benefits from scale? And how do we use that capability and knowledge that is generated through this changed curriculum and learning and teaching approach to actually address critical, global, local, and personal challenges? So rather than talking about, as we teach, we might teach accounting, talking about ABC Plumbing or, you know, Frank's accounting firm, we actually start to get students to talk about using accounting knowledge to address the environmental damage caused by plastic bags. And the data set they use to do their accounting on is actually about the removal of plastic bags and replacing them with a recyclable product. It's a very complex ecosystem of teaching, learning, and assessment, but for us, it was critical. And because we started working on it before the pandemic, it actually held us in good stead for how we were able to shift during the pandemic to being an entirely online, and now, well, until this week, hybridized, now back entirely online educational environment. I want to talk about two really simple examples of things that we did in this very complex ecosystem. If you're able to see my slides, I'd show you a very complex ecosystem diagram, so I will spare you the mind melting that will cause. But I want to talk about two really simple examples. The first is the lecture. So in 2019, the lecture is a pretty common sight for everybody. I would be showing you a picture of a lecture theatre at the moment. You don't need to think anything other than imagining what that lecture theatre looks like. And the lecture in 2019 was very much a repeated exercise. Because we can only fit 400 people in a lecture theatre, we have on average up to 2,000 students in any of our units of study. That had to be repeated 5 times. The same lecture repeated 5 times to 5 different groups of people. With 400, 450 people in a room, it is essentially broadcast. It's one person talking to 400. It's very static. There's a fixed screen. The person can't move from behind the teaching desk, and it's quite static. It's quite distant. The back of the lecture theatre is the distance of a distance learner. And it is quite traditional. It's what students have been expecting for when they go to university. Do they like it? Feedback generally not. Although interestingly, the feedback at the moment is they are desperate for it to return. And of course, as with any teaching, it ranged from amazing and inspirational to dull and boring. In 2021, the business school has shifted the way in which we do our lectures. Our lectures are all online, and they will remain online once we return to a campus-based experience. Our lectures are chunked. They're broken down into small pieces. Rather than a 2-hour block, they're broken down into small little bits of knowledge, constructed often in a linear way, but sometimes in a completely non-linear form. They're interactive. Students can engage with the lectures even if they are asynchronous. They use multiple voices, so not just a single person talking, but heaps of different people talking. They use different forms of media and different hybridized forms of media. And all the lectures that are delivered in the business school, we deliver 297 hours a week of lectures, are DIY. They're made by staff, some of them in very kind of, to use an English phrase, very Heath Robinson ways, where they've sort of mocked up different ways they can use visualizers and data projectors, but sometimes in very professional ways, and we've supported our staff to do that. Once again, They do range from amazing and inspirational to sometimes dull and boring. But the capacity to improve and redo a lecture that's recorded before students see it means that the first lecture is not better than the fifth when you've repeated it in the same sequence. So for us, we're changing the way in which our students engage with the lecture. We're moving away from this idea that it's linear. We're moving towards students having agency and choice over how they navigate through a lecture. We're encouraging our students to make a choice about what order they do topics in. We're giving our students the capability to look at a sequence and go, we've got 5 things here. We want you to choose 3. Which 3 you're interested in? And when you have multiple voices, and so one of the things we've done in a lot of our lectures is we have a 13-week semester. There's 13 series of 13 hours of lectures in there. Because we're using multiple voices, there is a real capability for someone, for example, talking about one of the units which I'll describe in a little while around leading it, which is called Leading in a Post-Crisis World. In that unit particularly, we've had voices from all across industry talking. But if you liked that particular person's industry perspective, they might come up again in week 7 and week 9. And when you're given options to choose who you might want to have that conversation with or want to hear from, the students have agency over their choice of to who they want to hear from. Some of them, we don't give agency. Some of them are really critical core pieces of learning. But in other instances, what we're trying to create, and we've described it very much as a snakes and ladders approach, where you can work your way through the snakes and ladders grid in whatever pace you wish. You can take a ladder and skip some bits, or you can work the snake down through the content. But the students have agency over that. So we think that's a really interesting way to approach the lecture that has held us in really good stead in order to prepare for where we are now in a pandemic. But most importantly, what it does is it removes the didacticism that is rooted in a lot of lectures. It removes the broadcast and builds in a sense of interactivity and engagement that fosters connection. My second example is a program we have called Leading in a Post-Crisis World. It started in 2020 as Leading in a Post-COVID World, which was a very preemptive promise that unfortunately we've not been able to deliver on the post-COVID bit. So we thought we'd go with post-crisis because we are always, as a society and as individuals, experiencing some form of crisis, preparing for some form of crisis and exiting another. So Leading in a Post-Crisis World is a program of 3 major components. It's got a curricular aspect where students can do units in how they can develop their capacities to be a leader through crisis. It's got extracurricular for students who don't want to pick up a unit but want to do activities that get them prepared to engage as leaders, and that's activities like leadership legacy workshops, learning how to do effective pitching, and connecting with the kind of research and innovative research that's coming out of the university that might give them some ideas about how they can develop different approaches and solve particular problems. One particular project which we're most proud of in Leading in a Post-Crisis World was a project called Future Makers. Future Makers was a crowdsourcing project. We had nearly 1,900 students from across the university come into a crowdsourcing platform and try and describe to us and to each other what they thought were the most wicked, difficult, challenging, frightening, exciting problems that the world was facing in 2020. So I'll put that filter on it. And then collectively crowdsource solutions to them. We dealt with how we get electric cars to be rolled out. We dealt with how we recover from the pandemic. We dealt with why is education in such a difficult situation. And these 1,800 people collectively came together in a very engaged, collegial way to try and come up with solutions using good crowdsourcing pedagogy. So we had lots of opportunities for students to vote and enhance other people's ideas, refine them, make them better, and really come together with some excellent ideas, all of which were presented in a forum called the Business Not As Usual Forum to industry, and which we broadcast live. This kind of thing is how we build connections in our classroom. The lecture, that's got an asynchronous element. This is synchronous. How do we make connections for our students in the classroom so that they engage in active ways, not just with each other, but with their own networks outside of the institution and with their own networks of academics and staff that are engaging with them through the teaching and learning. So to wrap this little sort of mini keynote up, what did we learn from this kind of approach? Now, this is only part of a very complex ecosystem of a lot of different things. I've just picked 2 examples. It's really important for us to design for students to have multiple entry points into and out of teaching and learning at the business school. To design for different speeds of learning. That with 16,500 students, they're going to be learning at different speeds and different paces. And that there are varied pathways through learning. There isn't a single way. This is not a scaffolded approach. There are multiple ways in which you can get from A to B, and how you engage with your learning will help you move between those multiple exit and entry points. We definitely want to design ecosystems that intersected, built dependencies, and encouraged engagement. We wanted people to have ways in which they might be in Unit X that connects them with people doing Unit Y. We also wanted to incorporate a really strong theme that in a digital environment and in a physical environment, visual images and stories were important. Disaggregated theory helps as a structural way to understand what you see in front of you, what you hear, and what the digital story that you want to tell is. So it's really important to incorporate those in. We also wanted to embrace the affordances of what we've called space agnostic learning, what a lot of institutions are calling hybridized or high flex learning. How do we actually design learning that doesn't build on only being capable to be done in a physical or an online space? How do you get people from physical and online spaces together working on common problems? And so we've done a lot of work on designing to do that. And obviously for us, at the very core of this is the idea that we really want to build a connected learning community, that at the heart of what we do is building connections between students, making those connections lasting, giving them capabilities to be leveraged to solve problems. So that leaves us at kind of, for me, on 4 simple points that I think will hopefully feed into the discussion. There is a risk at the end of all of this that institutions will want to snap back to the way we were in 2019. That the online exams that we've been running have got so many problems. Let's just go back to pen and paper. That students are desperate to go back to the lecture theatres so that they can cease attending by week 12. There is a real risk that we will not learn anything from our pandemic years. And so the real challenge for us as educators is how do we make sure that all the things we've done, we learn from them and that they feed into what education in 2022 becomes. There's also the risk that we will never feel normal again, that this will always feel like a churn and that we are constantly being buffeted by the forces of crisis. So there is an opportunity for us as an institution to decide what our normal is and resist the assertion that this will never be normal, that we are now in the era of the never normal. This offers us as an institution, as institutions, an opportunity to reimagine teaching and learning, to rethink about what teaching and learning for the modern era is. You can go back and look at 14th century paintings of lecture theatres and they look like they do now. What is our opportunity here to reimagine? And finally, for us to learn from the crisis, to learn from what we've had to go through in the last 2 years so that we are in a situation where what we do shifts the experience for our students. So I shall leave that at that.
Peter, thank you so very much for that intro piece to allow us to sort of delve into some stuff. And just a reminder for our audience, you can ask questions in the Q&A box and they will appear here on stage for us to ask. Before we get to audience questions, you've given me, we've got some notes that we put together a couple of weeks ago to think about what we might discuss. And I'm going to be awful. I'm going to change it all completely because you've excited me with your beginning of your keynote. So I actually listened and I actually took away something, and nothing excites me or engages me more than an analogy. So let's go with your analogy of snakes and ladders. And I'm going to connect it to student agency. So I think snakes and ladders is a great analogy, which is the idea that you can go up, but you may slip down, right? The idea of snakes and ladders. So how does a university like University of Sydney support students in making sure they're making good choices, not just a choice?
So that's a really interesting question. There's two parts to that. The first part of that is the changes that the federal government has made through the Job Ready Graduate Scheme or Job Ready Graduate Program that is looking at students' performance academically as a way of measuring whether they are actually making the right choice, whether they are actually engaging at a program level with the right types of learning, the right disciplines and the like. Now, I think that's a very big stick approach. It's not the carrot approach. To me, the most important part of students making the right choice from an agency perspective is twofold. One, that connection. If you feel you can go and ask somebody, whether that's a colleague in your cohort, whether that's a more experienced senior student who's perhaps been there and done that and moved through into the second, third years of undergraduate programs or the final year of a postgraduate program, where you feel you can get advice from academics, program leaders, your teachers. I think for students to be able to feel that they can interact to a point to be able to ask that type of question where you say to them, right, look, okay, you're asking that, should I be a business analyst? You're struggling in your business analytics program. You're really not engaging with the kind of deeply mathematical core knowledge that's necessary to this, and you're really struggling. What do you want out of that? Oh, well, you know, my dad told me I should be I work in data analytics because that's where all the money is. Right, okay, well, what do you really want to do? And you start to then position them to say, well, actually, maybe you could do something that with that data analytics knowledge that's not data analytics. And I think that advice role is really critical. How you do it at scale is the real challenge.
Yes.
My previous institution, London School of Economics in the UK, had 11,000 students in the entire institution. Sydney has 75,000. So that's one of the things we're really trying to work on now, is how you actually build a kind of ecosystem of networks around students so that there isn't just a single person having to be able to give that advice.
Yeah, absolutely. Which sort of is a nice way for us to sort of segue back to something that you talked about in your keynote. And I don't want to dwell on the pandemic, right? I don't want us to spend our time, you know, worrying about what has been. What I'm interested in what were the surprises you saw, either from student resilience or student experience or even academic resilience in that period, that you want to keep going and you want to amplify and you want to do bigger and you want to do better and you want to do more of?
So the two things that I think were most interesting to me were the absolute desire of students to be collaborative. We as institutions often structure assessment in ways that are quite individualistic, and we build structures in our assessments that are sometimes competitive. And you know, say, well, you got a grade slightly higher than you, and then, you know, these structures are not necessarily collaborative for students. And one of the things when we did Future Makers, which was not assessment, it was extracurricular activity which students did on top of their learning, to get 1,800 students from the business school wanting to collaborate. And when there's no grades, there's no what people would argue is the traditional motivation for participation, which is grades. And I don't necessarily make that case, but it is fairly a common story in many institutions that I've worked in.
Is that the institution or is it the learner that wants to focus on grades?
I think it's the institution or the individuals in the institution believing it's the focus of the learner. Because every time I do something that's not assessed, that's not credit bearing, and we do it well, students turn up. If they see a benefit for them in terms of their learning, they show. It's the same argument I make about attendance at lectures. Students stop attending lectures when they're not getting anything out of them. If they're getting stuff out of it and they think it's beneficial, students turn up because ultimately they're investing 3 years of their life in a degree. So that's a time investment that has to have a benefit for them at the end.
Yeah.
So yeah, no, I'm definitely of the belief that for us to be able to support collaboration was a really important insight. The other one that I think was really important that I found is that how do we actually, leverage is the wrong word, how do we engage with the uncertainty that students have? So at one end, we've got the argument that some course designers take and academics take, which is students are empty vessels when they arrive, and our job is to fill them up with knowledge and then push them out the end as, you know, semi-completed engineers, architects, business people, whatever. But my argument is that there's learning that comes from uncertainty, not knowing where your what the next footfall is, what's in front of you, and how do you actually create environments where students themselves learn from their uncertainty. And actually, the academics have uncertainty, and everyone is rent with uncertainty. So how do you design a learning experience that actually imbuilds that uncertainty in it? And I found that when we did that this time around in leading in a post-crisis world, the students actually embraced it. And I was quite surprised at that, because traditional logic says the moment you build uncertainty into something, students get frightened and they want certainty. They want to know when something's due, the date it's due, the minute it's due, what happens when it doesn't happen, all of those things. But actually building in a safe space to be uncertain was really, really important.
What I'm gonna do, Peter, is I want to come back to a really big thing that I want to talk about, which we spoke about, which is your middle out innovation model in a minute. But I want to come back to that because there's 3 or 4 questions that I want to cycle through if we can, and I want to do them, you know, fairly quickly because I think they're all interconnected, right? And I'm going to begin with this question here: is can you elaborate on the interactive asynchronous online lecture model you mentioned up in the beginning of your introductory piece?
Yep, sure. So the really simple version is all our lectures are produced and delivered through our learning management system, which is Canvas. We have built in, using various models of technology, H5P being the big one, which is a HTML5 creator, capabilities for students to interact directly with particular questions, to choose a particular pathway, and then have videos that trigger down that particular. I've chosen I'm interested in point A. Well, here's all the videos connected to point A. We have built in. We're working on this thing called synchronously asynchronous at the moment, and some of that is going to be about how we actually create very similar to when you watch an Instagram video. If anyone, any hipsters out there watch Instagram videos, you'll notice that even if you're watching it asynchronously, all the comments come in at the same time as you're watching it. So people putting hearts and thumbs up and all those things all pop up the screen in a fall. We're experimenting with ways in which that kind of technology can be used to create interaction. We're working as hard as we can, noting that asynchronous can be watched at any point in a 24-hour day. How do you fake synchronous interaction in an asynchronous way? But HTML5 and interactivity is a really simple way to start.
All right, so now let's, again, I'm gonna be an awful Q&A host here. These are 30-second responses because they literally are a bunch of great questions, but we don't have time to answer every one of them at 7 minutes. And then I do want to talk about your middle out innovation model. So I think this is more a comment than it is a question, but you feel free to jump and add any in there if you think that's useful.
I'm with you. I gave up lectures a long time ago, and I think in some ways it's a bit like, giving up anything that's addictive. Look, there are great lectures. There are people who are brilliant lecturers who can inspire.
So this is the next one that's connected to it, right? So here you go. Here's the next question. Maybe we haven't changed the lecture for so long because they work. All this passion interaction makes me weigh the value of didactics. Thoughts?
Look, there's no doubt about it. I am not an anti-lecturer. I think there are actually brilliant lecturers out there, but there's also the argument that it takes a lot of skill to do it really, really well. And if you can't, that's the thing. If we can, and someone actually asked, I noticed in your previous session, someone asked, how do we train people on a platform when we don't train them to be teachers? That is actually the fundamental problem. It takes a skill. We've got to train people better at it. Then lectures might actually be more valuable.
I'm going to ask you these two questions, but feel free to flick them through to the we can keep it. But I think they're good questions, but you don't have to feel compelled to answer.
Sure.
All right. Don't feel compelled to answer. Can you sell a premium university experience online given Open Unis have been doing it cheaper for decades?
Yes.
I went to one, it was okay.
Yes, you can. 100 times over. I can promise you that the way in which we do open learning, the way in which we do online learning could be 100 times better than it is in the vast majority. It just takes an institution to actually be willing to commit time, money, and a little bit of reputational risk to actually deliver it. But yes, I 100% believe it can be.
And also, price isn't an indicator of quality, by the way, as well. I would put that point in there as well. I think that we sometimes conflate that as humans, but it's not actually directly connected. Let's go to this one, and then I want to go and move to your innovation model. My experience that with student engagement with online lectures, course materials dropped substantially during COVID compared to face-to-face. Tips for changing this?
Yeah, they can, because once again, we've moved people from a relatively established model of education. And when you move from a standard lecture in a lecture theatre where your lecture recording platform does all the work for you, and you're used to showing your slides on giant 40-foot screens, when it's reduced down to a tiny screen like this, some of the limitations get exposed. So without a doubt, for us, the biggest thing we did was we gave pretty much most of our academics who were recording from home a microphone. That was the main thing we did. Give you a microphone so that the sound quality of your video immediately got better than what you were trying to use on your computer. And it's amazing how that was a gateway. Oh, maybe I should improve my video quality. Maybe I should start thinking about the way I do my slides. Maybe I should start thinking about doing editing, because you've opened the door that this is not a black box that requires a PhD in sound to make a good video.
Yeah. I will share that I a few years ago on a trade mission for EdTech to the US, ended up at Harvard and met with the team at HarvardX, and I can't remember the exact stats, so don't ever quote me, but it was something along the lines of they were finding the optimal length of a lecture or chunk of lecture was about 4 to 6 minutes. And as long as the academic can continue to refine the message to get the key messages down to that, student learning was improved than spending it in the 20-minute, 30-minute, 40-minute, 50-minute lecture. So I think there's lots of learning science that we can apply to these things as well. And I think that that's really around that sort of nice integration between EdTech companies, EdTech providers, the platform capability, and the need of academics and the need of educators to make sure they're hitting the student mark. Why don't we take that as a pivot point? I really am intrigued by your middle out innovation model. I'm wondering whether you might spend a couple of minutes, giving us an introduction to it, and then we can talk a little bit about some of the detail.
Yeah, so for many years, I've been looking at how we actually affect pedagogical change in an institution. Higher education institutions are slow-moving behemoths, and it's very hard often to make change in a way that's lasting or gets through to the entire institution and changes the very fabric and culture of the institution. And the two traditional ways they've always done this has been looking at bottom-up innovation, where we've got all these great innovators who all pilot different things, and they constantly are the first people to apply for grants and the first people to present at teaching and learning conferences and festivals and write papers, and they're brilliant at getting innovation. But it doesn't tend to get much out of that kind of frisson of people interested in that. Then you've got sort of top-down approach, and the top-down approach is always the Vice-Chancellor coming in saying, you will do this. I used to work in university in the UK where the Vice-Chancellor literally stamped his fist on the table and said, everyone by the end of the year will be doing online assessment. And because the Vice-Chancellor dictated it, everybody did it. Didn't come with resources, didn't come with training, didn't come with any motivation, and it didn't last once the Vice-Chancellor left. So top-down has its limitations as well. So for many years, I've been trying to think, what's the way in which you actually create a lasting pedagogical change environment, but also make sure that it does impact on the culture and structure of the organisation? And I sort of came up with this idea of middle out. And the idea of middle out is that you find a sort of parts of the organisation that are of critical importance. They don't have to be the biggest. They don't have to be the largest. They don't have to be the most important, but are actually the most visible. And sometimes that's the highest reputation academic you've got. Sometimes it's the most visible program. Sometimes it's a core unit. But you take the things that are very visible, that if you transform and you change, someone looks and says, oh, if they can do it, why can't I? And David mentioned Harvard before. One of the really interesting things was a Harvard academic, which I met, who was a professor, Nobel Prize winning physicist, well into his 70s, apparently one of the worst lecturers Harvard's ever had. And students were bored out of their skulls. And so educational development colleagues worked with him there, made him look brilliant in shooting video. They had him walk around the campus like a rock star. He had a makeup done. He had the whole thing, and he returned his lectures into videos. He loved it. He thought he looked like white hot. But everyone just looked and said, oh, if person X can do this, why can't I? And that's the principle of middle out. How do you actually get someone that's in the middle that both the innovators can look at and say, I'm doing all that already and I can make it better. You've still got the top going, this is something that we need to do institutionally, but you're starting to get that momentum in the middle, because when you think about institutional change, it's easy to convert the bottom 25% or the innovating 25%. Well, they're not the bottom, the innovating 25%. It's almost impossible to move the intransigence. It's the 50% in the middle you have to move. And that's where middle out focuses on.
There was a great question. I'm going to see if I can find it, because I think it, I'll come to it in a minute, which is around the size of your team. But I wanted to, before we move away from your middle out innovation model, what is the core benefit you see of finding, for want of a better term, that pilot, that lighthouse in the middle who's got the whole profile and they're critical and stuff? What's the main benefit you see of having this idea of connecting around it? Not the grassroots nor the top down, but out of the middle. What's the key benefit? So
the key benefit is that group in the middle, that 50% in the middle, are looking for a hook. The vast majority of them are simply have got, whether it's a piece of fear that's holding them back, whether it's a previous experience that's holding them back. It's providing and I think that lighthouse analogy is a really good one. It provides them with a lighthouse to navigate towards. And because that group is only really one step away often from the bit that gets them to innovate, to change, then having someone that they can actually see, oh, they changed, oh, they did that unit, that program's done it. It makes them feel safer. Because ultimately, whilst I talk about uncertainty, there is a major benefit to feeling safe. And
Which is actually, I have a question around this, because I think that innovation also requires the capacity to be wrong, right? To be truly innovative, you have to be willing to be wrong. How do you support both academics and institutions that they're working in feel comfortable that you can be wrong?
so that's a really interesting question, and I'll start that with when I was at the LSE, we had a student forum, and one of my most engaged academics, Professor of Sociology, stood up and said, "Look, I try all these things in my classroom, and sometimes they work and sometimes they don't." And the students got up and were livid at him. "How dare you experiment on me? How dare I pay good money to get a well-structured education?" And this guy he freaked at this. And it made me start to think, how do you do that in a way that doesn't treat the students as an experimental bunnies? And how do you actually ensure that all the other structures that are around the institution, student satisfaction surveys, performance management, academic professional development, all those kind of things don't create that environment? It is really hard. The two big things for me are, and it's going to sound like a cliche, but it is creating a safe space for failure. It is allowing things to not work, but having good data, good rigorous evaluation, and good research to make sure that we understand why it didn't work.
Yep.
And then that's the main stuff. The other thing is to not punish. Reward, not punish.
Yep. And we've got 2 minutes left, so I just want to run through 2 questions, because I think they're really important questions, and they've come in from the audience. So I feel that we should just very briefly talk about this, which is UCED committed to building its own solutions, or do you see a role as finding and integrating solutions that have been built by outside providers?
So my perspective on vendors, and I've written a blog post about this for the LSE Higher Education blog, is that we need to work with vendors. But we need to work with vendors as partners. So we need to structure our particular way in which we do education and have technology support and pedagogical support that actually delivers that way of learning. We definitely don't need to be in a situation where we change to suit the provision of a piece of technology, and that's a really difficult argument and debate to have. But for me, without a doubt, I don't buy bespoke. Bespoke is a dangerous pathway to shadow IT and the depths of pits of having to redo it yourself in 25 years' time when you realise your platform is broken.
There's lots of dead-end products out there that have been employed.
There is, and that's why working with vendors to actually feed into their development through our experiences is just as important for us to hear from vendors to feed into our pedagogy.
Fantastic, Peter. We could go on for a very long time, and there are lots of other questions. And what we will do is we'll cycle them through it towards the end, and so that people can hear that. On behalf of everyone, Peter, thank you so very much for your time.